Imagine a king whose own body was literally breaking down while he was still breathing, pus oozing out, rotting flesh, and a smell so horrible people noticed it rooms away. Welcome to the true story of Henry VIII. And trust me, what you're about to hear will make even your worst nightmares feel tame. But the real truth is far darker. So twisted that historians have tried for centuries to soften how monstrous he really was. This was a man who turned marriage into a death warrant, and made the Tower of London the scariest place in all of England. Most people know Henry VIII as that oversized, fun-loving king who couldn't hang on to a wife. We're talking about a ruler whose paranoia was so deep that he slept with loaded weapons at arm's reach, whose appetite would make a professional food competitor tap out, and whose treatment of women went far beyond simple execution into mental torture, could shock even modern-day serial killers. Before we jump into this complete horror show, remember to hit that subscribe button, and tell me in the comments where you're rewatching from. I'd love to see how connected we all are across the world. Now, get ready, because once you understand the real Henry VIII, you'll never look at Tudor history or royal power the same way again. His body was so disturbingly ruined that even people in medieval times, who were used to disease and filth, could barely stand to be near him. The once reasonable young king turned increasingly paranoid, violent, and totally unpredictable. The accident left severe leg wounds that never healed, and over the years they turned into giant, festering ulcers that ate away at more and more of his lower body. Let us start with the most stomach-churning fact about him. In the last decade of his life, Henry had become a living, breathing horror story. The stench was so overpowering that courtiers literally gagged as they approached him. He was knocked out cold for over 2 hours, which in those days, with primitive medical knowledge, was basically being clinically dead. Servants would hold perfumed cloths to their faces whenever they had to help him, and some even vomited on the spot. This wasn't just a guy who got overweight or a bit sick. His face became so puffy with fat that his eyes turned to tiny slits, and his neck completely disappeared, leaving him looking like a giant balloon on shoulders. Henry's journey from athletic young prince to a walking nightmare started around 1536, when he had a catastrophic jousting accident at Greenwich Palace. Imagine your job description including clean up falling pieces of the king's body. When he finally woke up, those close to him saw instant personality changes. His monstrous appearance, foul smell, and unpredictable rage made court life a living nightmare. And physically, things got even worse, which explains his dramatic weight gain and mood swings, and maybe even diabetes, which would have made the leg wounds worse. Attendants had to carry a portable toilet for him because he could barely make it to a bathroom. These weren't tiny cuts, they were massive, gaping sores that dripped pus, blood, and decaying flesh. Historical accounts describe how the smell was noticeable several rooms away. His own doctors were so revolted by the state of his legs, they would try to find excuses to avoid examining them, even though refusing the king was basically treason. As Henry grew older, his weight skyrocketed to about 400 pounds, with a waistline over 54 inches. That's wider than many people are tall, and music to a monster who found pleasure in destroying lives. Moving around was impossible without help, so he used special wheelchairs pulled by teams of servants to get from room to room. But here's the truly horrifying part. As they rolled him along, pieces of infected flesh literally fell off his legs, leaving behind trails of decaying royal skin throughout the palace. Servants had to follow behind with cloths and buckets to clean up the bits of rotting flesh that dropped wherever the king went. People were so traumatized that many quit their positions, even though serving the king was considered one of the highest honors of the day. The psychological impact was massive. Courtiers who once fought to be in the king's presence now dreaded being called to see him. And that was just the beginning. Henry's head injury had shattered his personality, changing him from a man who once wrote love letters. He began ordering executions for the smallest insults, and made people watch their loved ones die before killing them. 2. Modern experts believe he suffered from multiple conditions that made his final years sheer agony: morbid obesity, infected ulcers, probably Cushing's syndrome. The cruel irony. Henry, who insisted God chose him to rule, couldn't even control his own bladder in the end. The same king who executed people for disrespect was rotting away in the most humiliating way possible. And that, believe me, was only the start. Catherine developed terrible stomach problems, which many historians believe were caused by years of constant stress, and possibly even poisoning attempts. When she finally died in 1536, She was completely alone, except for a few loyal servants by her side. Henry refused to go to her funeral, and didn't even allow their daughter Mary to visit her dying mother. Catherine's final letters to Henry, pleading with him to have mercy on their daughter and declaring her love even after everything, were completely ignored. The man she had loved and served faithfully for more than 20 years couldn't even bother to acknowledge her death. Anne Boleyn's fate was somehow even more horrifying. Henry showed how twisted he really was by planning out every detail of her psychological torture. When he decided to get rid of Anne, he didn't just order her execution outright. Instead, he built an entire conspiracy to break her spirit before killing her. Henry first ordered her to be burned at the stake, the usual punishment for adultery, but then mercifully changed it to beheading. He even brought in a special executioner from France, supposedly to give her a clean death, but really just to prolong her agony as she waited for him to arrive. Henry's cruelty peaked when he made and watch as all 5 men were executed for allegedly sleeping with her. She was maybe 19 or 20 years old. While Henry, now a grotesquely obese man in his late 40s with rotting legs, decided to make her his 5th wife. First, he had Anne's musician Mark Myton tortured until he confessed to sleeping with her. He didn't just execute her, he passed a law making it treason for anyone to marry the king without revealing their entire sexual history. Just imagine being a young girl forced to share a bed with a man whose body was literally decomposing. But Henry didn't stop there. He also arrested 4 other men, including Anne's own brother George, and forced them to confess to adultery with Anne as well. Imagine the unbearable pain of seeing innocent people destroyed simply because they knew you. He locked Catherine away in the Tower of London for months, where he played mind games with her, switching between false promises of forgiveness and terrifying death threats. She had to stand there, knowing she would be next, watching her brother's severed head raised up for the crowd. A final, brutal message meant to completely shatter her before her own execution. Within days of Jane's funeral, he was already making arrangements to find a new wife. She suffered for more than 30 hours in agony, but Henry's doctors focused only on saving the child. Even her death was turned into another layer of psychological torture. But her story also shows Henry's massive skill for manipulation. When he decided he didn't want to, Anne was so terrified she agreed, even thanking Henry for sparing her life. God said she would swing from complete silence to screaming fits that echoed throughout the tower. He basically forced her to choose between humiliating herself publicly or ending up like Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. Anne picked survival, but had to spend the rest of her life pretending that her marriage to Henry had never happened. But even her story shows Henry's inhuman attitude toward his wives. Henry had already signed an arrest warrant accusing her of heresy. Anne spent her last days in the Tower of London, swinging between hysterical fits and eerie.com, sometimes laughing out of nowhere, sometimes praying for hours on end, knowing she would soon die for crimes she didn't commit. And after watching so many innocent men die because of her, it drove her straight to the edge of madness. She convinced Henry that her religious debates were not about correcting him, but about learning from his great wisdom, basically feeding his ego so he'd spare her. His appetite was so extreme and so out of control that today it would basically be classified as a mental illness. In his later years, Henry was consuming close to 5,000 calories a day, more than double what even an active adult male needs. And remember, by this point he could barely walk. Divorce was off the table, running away was considered treason, and fighting back could mean death, not just for them, but for their entire families. It was the way he ate, obsessively, almost like a religious ritual, that was the most disturbing. Then there was Catherine Howard, whose story is perhaps the most disturbing of all, because she was barely out of her teens when Henry chose her. The marriage itself was traumatizing enough. When Henry found out Catherine had previous relationships before marrying him, he showed the full extent of his cruelty. That is how petty and narcissistic he was, changing the entire legal system, just because he discovered his teenage wife was not a virgin. Henry didn't stop there though. One day he'd suggest he might pardon her if she confessed. The next he'd send details of how her execution would be carried out. The psychological torment was so brutal that Catherine had multiple mental breakdowns in prison. When she was finally executed, witnesses said she looked years older than she actually was. The stress had changed her appearance completely. Then there was Jane Seymour, who many called the lucky wife, because she died naturally. Jane died from complications after giving birth to Henry's son Edward, but Henry's reaction showed how little he cared about her as a person. The worst part was how Jane was treated during labor. Some accounts say Henry actually ordered them to prioritize Edward over Jane, treating her like a disposable tool for producing an heir. Then came Anne of Cleves, who might seem lucky because she survived. Stay married to Anne, He threatened her with execution if she didn't accept an annulment. That's the kind of psychological pressure Henry could apply. Finally, there was Catherine Parr, the wife who did survive, but only barely. Catherine actually came very close to execution herself. Catherine only managed to save her own life with clever psychological manipulation. Imagine the mental strain of having to measure every single word you spoke to your own husband, knowing one wrong line could get you killed. Catherine Parr spent her entire marriage walking on eggshells around a man whose mood swings could turn deadly in a heartbeat. The most horrifying part of Henriette's treatment of all these women is that none of them had any real way to escape. These women were completely trapped with a husband who grew more physically revolting and mentally unstable every single year, with no hope for freedom except through death. And if you think that's bad, just wait until you hear about Henry's eating habit. This man didn't just eat like a king. He ate like he wanted to finish the entire food supply of England by himself, but the amount of food wasn't even the craziest part. Henriette's relationship with food was mixed up with such extreme paranoia that every meal turned into a bizarre theatrical event. A normal dinner for Henry VIII might feature an entire roasted pig, multiple whole chickens, various types of fish, piles of bread, and enough wine to knock out a dozen men. Over 200 people worked non-stop just to satisfy his appetite. More stuff than many modern restaurants even dream of. His royal kitchens made over 800 different dishes every single day for his household, with Henry personally sampling dozens of them. Henry honestly believed that different foods could magically change his body and mind. And the strangest of all, Henry was sure that oysters would boost his sexual stamina. So he devoured huge amounts of oysters before visiting his wife's chambers, never realizing that his rotting body and horrifying smell were far bigger turnoffs than any diet problem. For example, he was convinced that eating swan would make him more graceful, even though by then he needed special equipment just to stand. Nobody dared look disgusted or bored, because that might be seen as insulting the king, which could mean a death sentence. These dinners became a twisted psychological nightmare, forcing everyone to applaud a man destroying himself with food. But here's where his eating habits crossed the line from simple gluttony into something truly disturbed, not because they were unhealthy, but because he saw them as too common. Foods like turnips, barley, and peas were forbidden, even though they were probably way better for his health than all the meat and sugar he consumed, and made sure even the salt, spices, and water were tested by different people. His kitchens devoured massive amounts of meat, grain, and other essentials that could have fed hundreds of poor families. Henry's gluttony wasn't just self-destruction, it was a symbol of the insane inequality of his rule. Criticizing the king's habits was treason, so they had to stand by helplessly while he destroyed his health, unable to say a word that might save him. Basically, a simple meal turned into a military-style mission involving dozens of staff and hours of planning. His extreme eating made his medical conditions worse, which made him eat even more to feel better. A vicious cycle that sped up his physical decay. As his legs grew more infected and painful, he ate more to distract himself. Henry insisted the guards be switched out every few hours, terrified they might plot his assassination if they stayed too long, but as emergency escape routes in case assassins came for him in the night. And those guards, they were watched by other guards, layering surveillance on top of surveillance, turning the king's private chambers into a prison. He slept with loaded crossbows beside his bed and daggers under his pillow. Armed guards had to stand watch inside his bedroom all night while he slept. When he couldn't move around, he ate out of boredom. Henry made important political and military decisions while he was drunk and stuffed with food, barely able to speak clearly. There are reports of treaties being signed, wars being declared, and people being sentenced to death, while Henry was completely out of his senses from wine and overeating. He thought eating huge amounts of venison would somehow make him a better hunter, even though he couldn't ride a horse or pull a bow anymore. When everything else failed, he could still order gigantic feasts and force people to watch him devour them. Eating became his way of showing royal power, even while he looked more like a monster than a king. Just picture this giant, rotting king slowly shoveling down enough food to feed a small village, while everyone else had to pretend it was perfectly normal. There are stories of Henry throwing up huge amounts of barely digested food, then demanding more food right after. His stomach had stretched so much that normal meals didn't even make him feel full anymore. But that wasn't enough to calm his paranoid fears. He demanded the food tasters wait 30 minutes after tasting before he would eat, just in case there was a slow-acting poison. His mealtime rituals were completely insane. Every single bite had to be tested by multiple servants to check for poison. Even that didn't satisfy him. Henry also ordered his kitchens to be completely sealed with guards watching every step. Dinner with Henry was practically a performance. He ate in front of hundreds of courtiers, and these feasts could drag on for 4 hours straight. Courtiers were expected to look impressed, even while the stench from his infected legs made them want to vomit. Henry's paranoia about food grew so ridiculous that he outright banned certain foods from the royal table. The irony is incredible. While Henry was gorging on feasts, big enough for entire villages, most of England was struggling with food shortages and crop failures. It gets even worse. The most horrific part was how this all connected to his rotting body. By his final years, his eating was so out of control that servants were genuinely afraid he might actually die from overeating in one meal. Psychologically, food became Henry's only real pleasure and sense of control in a life where his own body was collapsing and his mind was falling apart. The waste was staggering. Leftover food from royal meals could have fed hundreds, but was often just thrown away or given to dogs instead of the poor. Even his own doctors were too scared to tell him he was killing himself with food. Henry's paranoia didn't stop at food. It poisoned the entire kingdom, turning England into a surveillance state that would shock even modern dictators. In his last years, Henry was so sure that everyone was plotting to kill him that he turned royal life into a psychological nightmare, where nobody could trust anyone, and a single careless word might get you executed. Look at Henry's bedroom, for example, to see how far this went. But even that wasn't enough. Henry also ordered secret passages to be built in every palace he lived in, not for romance or escape from lovers.
These secret passages formed an elaborate maze of hidden corridors and escape routes that allowed Henry to move around his own palaces without being seen by his staff. He even had peepholes installed in the walls so he could spy on his own courtiers, and primitive listening devices set up in meeting rooms so he could eavesdrop on private conversations. Nobody ever knew when the king might be watching or listening, creating a constant atmosphere of fear and surveillance. He actually built an entire network of spies whose job was to spy on other spies. There were informants keeping tabs on informants, creating this twisted spiderweb of suspicion where no one knew who they could trust. Court life turned into a psychological nightmare, where a careless word to the wrong person might get you accused of treason. Of course, by modern standards, the technology was laughably basic, but the psychological impact was enormous. But Henry's paranoia went to even more extreme levels. One of the most disturbing elements of Henry's surveillance network was how it tore families apart. Henry actually suspected his own children of plotting against him, yet spies keeping track of Princess Mary and Princess Elizabeth, convinced they might try to overthrow him. These were children, yet he treated them like enemy spies under his own roof. Not only did he have multiple food tasters, but he demanded that his meals be prepared in sealed kitchens under heavy guard. With soldiers watching every step of the cooking, every ingredient was tested by different people, and even the plates and utensils had to be examined for poison. Each wife had to endure constant psychological games, with Henry setting traps to test their loyalty. Henry had a dream that the man was plotting against him, and that was enough to have him killed, even though the Marquise had shown nothing but loyalty his entire life. He'd have servants stage fake conversations to see how his wife would react, or pretend to be sick to watch whether she showed the correct level of worry, or might actually hope he would die. Servants betrayed their masters to protect themselves. Everyone lived with the fear that they could be the next victim of Henry's wild suspicions. If he dreamed that someone might betray him, or if another person hinted that someone could be disloyal, he'd have them killed on the spot. Every conversation had to be carefully managed in case it was twisted into evidence of distrust, and every relationship had to be constantly judged for whether it might make Henry suspicious. People who might have genuinely supported him became resentful and terrified, while any true enemies simply learned to be more sneaky. Children were encouraged to report on their parents. Husbands and wives were rewarded for betraying each other. Servants were given incentives to inform on their masters. The constant suspicion bred so much hatred and fear that people had more reasons than ever to turn against him. Imaginary threats distracted everyone from real dangers, making Henry's worst nightmares come true. These women were basically prisoners, unable to have a private word or personal friendship without wondering if it would get back to their increasingly unstable husband. By the end of his reign, Henry was a prisoner of his own terror, unable to trust anyone, unable to form true relationships. But worse than that was the fact that his body was literally falling apart. Palace servants were ordered to follow behind him with cloths and buckets, cleaning up bits of decomposing king along the way, and unable to even enjoy the power he'd worked so hard to maintain. Henry had successfully created a society where personal relationships meant nothing compared to loyalty to the crown, and where even trusting your own family was dangerous. Some records say the smell was detectable from several rooms away, and servants had to hold perfumed cloths over their faces just to do their jobs. Even in death, he managed to traumatize everyone around him, creating one last act of grotesque horror that summed up his reign perfectly. Loyalty and innocence offered no protection against his nightmarish paranoia. Salt had to be tested, water had to be approved, and everything had to be overseen by security officers, who themselves were watched by other security officers. His paranoia about food was equally insane. The security around Henry's meals was so extreme that cooking a simple dinner turned into a military-level operation. The kitchen staff lived in constant terror that a simple mistake could be labeled an assassination attempt, getting them executed, and his suspicions didn't stop with the adults around him. Just think about the psychological trauma for Mary and Elizabeth. Growing up knowing their own father saw them as possible threats that affected their entire lives. The most grotesque part of Henry's paranoia was how it poisoned his marriages. Henry even had his wives followed by spies who reported on their every move. Henry's paranoia grew so unhinged that he started executing people for crimes they hadn't even committed yet. The Tower of London was constantly filled with victims whose only crime was being close to Henry while he was in one of his paranoid episodes. One of the most disturbing examples was the execution of the Marquis of Exeter. This set a terrifying standard, making everyone in Henry's world live in constant fear. Henry's paranoia was so infectious that it spread through his entire court, and then through England itself. Nobles spied on one another hoping for rewards. It destroyed all trust. Nobody could rely on their friends, their families, or even their closest servants. The most tragic thing was that Henry's paranoia ended up destroying real loyalty and creating the very betrayal he feared. The endless surveillance didn't actually make Henry safer. It made him more alone, more cut off, and ironically, more at risk. The once popular, charismatic king had become a frightened, lonely, unstable dictator, seeing enemies in every shadow and finding peace nowhere. And the greatest irony, all his elaborate security made him less safe, not more. It was a tragic, self-fulfilling prophecy that built the very environment of betrayal he claimed to fear most. You might think that death would finally end Henry VIII's endless chaos and horror, but you'd be wrong. Let's talk about Henry's final weeks. They were straight out of a medieval horror movie. By then, Henry had become so enormous he couldn't support his own weight, needing entire teams of servants to carry him in chairs equipped with pulleys and wheels. His leg wounds were so badly infected that pieces of rotting flesh fell off him as he was carried from one room to another. Imagine trying to stay sane while your job was to clean up pieces of your king's body every day. The stench coming off Henry was so overpowering that even his doctors, who were used to medieval filth, had to leave the room to throw up. There are even accounts describing the stench as worse than London's open sewers, which is saying a lot, given the terrible hygiene standards of the 16th century.
Henry's death scene in England looks straight out of a supernatural horror story. His body had become so grotesquely swollen that his skin was stretched tight and shiny, giving him an appearance witnesses described as barely human. The extreme obesity, combined with massive infections and fluid buildup, had transformed the king into something closer to a monster than a man. But the psychological horror of Henry's final days went far beyond how he looked. The same man who had terrorized everyone around him for decades was now completely helpless, dependent on the mercy of the very servants he had bullied and terrified for years. These attendants, who had once feared his violent rages, were now responsible for the most personal care imaginable, dealing with a body falling apart in the most disgusting ways possible. His body was wrapped in lead sheets and sealed in multiple wooden boxes in a desperate attempt to contain what he had become, but it didn't work. Imagine having to scoop up pieces of your former king from a splattered coffin, all while trying not to vomit from the stench. And the irony of that wasn't lost on anyone who witnessed Henry's final moments. The king who claimed to be God's chosen ruler, the supreme power on earth, ended up as literal dog food on a dirty highway. His attendants had to carry portable toilets wherever he went, because he could barely move from one room to another without accidents. The same man who once executed people for showing him disrespect was literally breaking down in the most humiliating ways. It took multiple tries just to get him buried properly, and the construction of his tomb was delayed for years, because no one wanted to work near Henry's decaying corpse. The king who had claimed God chose him to rule, who had demanded total respect and obedience, couldn't even control his own bodily functions in the end. Some said it was his ghost seeking revenge, but historians think it was probably just more gases leaking out as the body kept decomposing. Several of the servants who cared for him during his last illness and handled his corpse died themselves within weeks, possibly from infections picked up from his rotting flesh, just like he had caused chaos, horror, and trauma in life. His death left behind disgust, fear, and psychological damage for everyone who came close to him. The trauma of serving a violent, unpredictable king who then fell apart so horribly seems to have literally killed some of them. A man who lived without any limits, who consumed whatever he wanted, who destroyed anyone who stood in his way in the end. He had become too corrupt even for a coffin to hold him. All the power, all the titles, the palaces, the rituals, stripped away by a rotting body that showed exactly who he really was, a disgusting, corrupted human being whose very presence was toxic. When Henry finally died on January 28, 1547, no one wanted to get close enough to confirm it. His corpse smelled so horrific and looked so awful that even his personal physicians were hesitant to go near him. The king, who demanded worship and total obedience, ended up so revolting that only animals would go near his remains. It took hours before anyone was brave enough to check for sure that the king was actually dead, because inspecting his body was considered almost unbearable. She never married, possibly because she had seen how horribly women were treated around absolute power. But the real horror came after death. Henry's corpse was so swollen with gases from decomposition that they had to reinforce his coffin to hold back the pressure. During the funeral procession from London to Windsor Castle, the gases inside his corpse built up so much that the coffin literally exploded. The lead lining tore open, spraying rotting royal remains all over the inside of the funeral hearse. She watched her father execute her own mother, Anne Boleyn, when Elizabeth was just 2 years old. Her entire childhood was filled with fear of being declared illegitimate or unwanted, depending on Henry's mood. The smell was so intense that the entire funeral train had to stop while servants tried to clean up the mess with buckets and rags. What should have been a dignified royal funeral turned into a grotesque cleanup job that scarred everyone involved. And if that wasn't horrifying enough, there were reports of dogs licking up bits of Henry's remains that had leaked onto the road. It was a symbol so perfect it almost felt planned. Even his burial mocked everything he had ever stood for. They had to dig his grave extra wide just to fit the enormous coffin, but the ground kept collapsing under the weight of the lead. For months afterward, people claimed they could still smell his body leaking through the ground, leading to rumors that his remains were continuing to rot in ways that seemed unnatural. Even years after he died, people reported strange noises and terrible smells coming from his tomb. The idea that Henry's corpse was so corrupted it couldn't even decompose properly became a popular explanation for all the weird disturbances around his grave. The psychological impact on the people who had to deal with Henry's death was huge, but maybe the most chilling part of Henry's death was how perfectly it summed up his entire reign. The explosion of Henry's coffin became a twisted symbol of everything wrong with his rule. His body, bloated with the excess of his own life, refused to stay contained even in death. It was the final, brutal irony, the fact that dogs were willing to eat what was left of him, while human beings couldn't stand to get close, says everything about what Henry had become. Henry VIII's death should have brought relief to England, but the psychological and political scars he left behind lasted long after his rotting body was locked away. His daughter Mary, for example, was so damaged by seeing how Henry treated her mother, Catherine of Aragon, that she spent her own reign trying to undo everything her father did, earning the nickname Bloody Mary because of her violent persecution of Protestants. The scars left by growing up under Henry's constant suspicion, seeing her mother broken, living in fear of being executed herself, turned Mary into yet another tyrant who ruled through terror. Elizabeth, Henry's other surviving daughter, was traumatized in a different way. Elizabeth grew up with deep trust issues and a powerful sense of paranoia that shaped her reign. Henry's paranoid executions had destroyed so many noble families that huge gaps in the power structure appeared, leading to decades of political instability. Families that had served the crown faithfully for generations were destroyed simply because Henry suspected them of disloyalty, while opportunistic newcomers rose to power by betraying their former masters to gain royal favor. Henry's reign permanently damaged the traditional structures of English aristocracy, breaking apart the old bonds of loyalty and trust. Henry's decision to make himself the head of the English Church had nothing to do with genuine religious belief. The religious chaos he unleashed by breaking from Rome didn't stop when he died. It kept tearing England apart for generations. The idea that a king could simply rewrite the laws, execute nobles at will, and reshape entire institutions for his personal gain became part of the royal playbook. Yet that selfish move sparked centuries of religious warfare, persecution, and civil conflict that cost thousands of lives. It was all about getting rid of Catherine of Aragon, so he could remarry. The man who liked to call himself England's greatest king had actually driven his kingdom to the edge of economic ruin. Even worse, Henry's reign established some truly dangerous precedents for royal power that echoed for centuries. The real Henry VIII, stripped of all the romanticized nonsense and historical whitewashing that somehow turned one of history's most revolting monsters into a figure of fascination rather than horror. Later monarchs saw Henry as an example of how far absolute power could go. instead of as a warning about what happens when power goes completely unchecked. We turned a man whose own body was literally decomposing while he lived, who tormented his wives before executing them, and who turned an entire kingdom into a surveillance nightmare, into the hero of romantic movies and television dramas. This was a man who was fundamentally broken, physically, psychologically twisted, and so monstrous that he traumatized nearly everyone who ever came close to him. Remember the wives who lived in constant terror of his violent mood swings. Remember the thousands who died because this monster couldn't control his paranoia. Henry turned England from a relatively stable medieval society into a paranoid surveillance state, where no one could trust their friends or even their own family. The financial damage Henry caused was enormous. His endless feasting, grand palaces, and constant military adventures drained the royal treasury and left England in debt for decades. His story shouldn't be entertaining. It should be a warning about what happens when a society lets one person have total control and refuses to hold its leaders accountable. That atmosphere of fear and suspicion lasted long after Henry's corpse was sealed away, shaping how the English related to authority and to each other for generations. But perhaps the most lasting damage was psychological. Personal relationships came second to survival, and saying the wrong thing could mean death. So, there you have it. This wasn't a misunderstood king who made a few tragic mistakes. The worst part of Henry's legacy isn't just what he did. It's how history has tried to clean up his image. It's as if we've all decided to forget how truly horrific he was. Henry VIII stands as a symbol of the absolute worst that human beings can become when they're given unlimited power with zero consequences. So the next time you see Henry VIII shown as some charming, larger-than-life, romantic figure, remember the servants forced to clean up pieces of his rotting flesh. Remember that even his coffin couldn't contain the corruption of his body, just like his kingdom couldn't contain the corruption of his soul. This is what unchecked power really looks like. This is what happens when we let monsters wear crowns. And this is why we can't ever allow ourselves to forget the truly horrifying story of Henry VIII, but the grim, disgusting, human reality behind England's most terrifying king.